Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Are you ready, fellas?
Yeah. Welcome back to the New Thinkery. My name is David Barr, and with me, as always, is my good friend Alex Priu. How are you, Alex?
Doing well. I'm feeling real strong. I've got rippling biceps from carrying this gigantic book around.
Yeah, me too. I was looking for a weight loss program, as you know, and I was sent this wonderful new edition by W.B. Allen on Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws. And what's great is it has the French on the left and the English on the right. So it already took a very long book and just made it heavier. How are
Greg, how
you,
you?
McBrayer? How are you?
Oh, I'm peachy. I can't even lift this book. I had to sort of I had to ask two undergraduate students to hold it for me and turn the pages.
Yeah, and I find also that people that deny liberalism and um, have unkind things to say about philosophers, you can throw the book at them. It causes harm, depending on how strong you are. But so today, we have a very, very, a guest that'll be well known to many of our listeners, the father of Daniel Allen, an eminent classicist at Harvard University. Which we have to talk about your daughter. I didn't know that. That's really cool. But it's Dr. W.B. Allen. How are you?
I am wonderful. I'm so glad to be with you. And I can't pass up the opportunity after your initial comments to tell you that I'm always quick to remind people that while it's a 1,000-page book, you only really have to read half of it.
But I have to say, Greg texted me, and he's a true American patriot, and he said he ripped out every page with French, and there was none left.
That's right.
I said,
That's
Greg,
right.
it's
That's right.
every other page you're gonna miss him. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I can make 1,000 jokes. The pen is mightier than the sword, especially if you write this many words and have a 10 pound book. But this is a massive undertaking, a massive achievement. We should be clear. It's a new critical edition of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, which includes also a formidable commentary
A
as
very
well.
interesting commentary. Yeah. And there's a bit of a Montesquieu revival in the air. I don't know if that's fair, but I recall Stuart Warner's new edition of the Persian Letters. So when we found out about that a new edition of the Spirit of the Laws was on its way, we were rather excited because the last one, WB, was when with the Ann Kohler.
1995 with Ann Kohler.
Yeah.
Yes.
The blue book.
Yes, from Cambridge.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about
a fine book, by the way. And
Okay.
indeed, it's part of the story of this book because Anne was a dear friend. We were both in graduate school at the same time, colleagues. We would meet at Political Science Association meetings and at the homes of our mentors because we shared a family of mentors, we'll put it that way, people in the Strauss, Cropsey, Jaffa family. And so we were very close, actually, in many ways. But we did not realize that we were both, as senior graduate students, working on the same project, which was Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. And she was busy working on her translation. I was busy on mine. Hers was nearer completion than mine was by the time this all surfaced, at which point I essentially put mine on the shelf. And because Anne was dear to me, I wanted her book to have a full run and see how it was and to give it fair appraisal. And unfortunately, she passed away before it was even in print because she had a sudden brain aneurysm, which made it even harder for me to think about taking up my work. So I really did put mine on the shelf, gave her full space, taught it several years, read it carefully, and finally decided it didn't quite do it, possibly potentially because she wasn't the one who finished it. She had to have associates complete it for her. But there were elements in the translation itself that I thought really needed to be attended to independently. And that's why I therefore resumed my own project and completed it in the fashion that I have.
That's a really nice story, actually. I thought it was going to be a revenge tale, but you did. So this is that's a nice a token of friendship. None of my two other co-hosts would ever do this for me. Let anyone for you. But how do you guys want to jump? I mean, yeah, I was going to say provide an overview for our listeners unfamiliar with the work, but Greg, how would you suggest we best?
Maybe one question to start with would be, what are the ways in which you mentioned that there's maybe a couple of shortcomings in the previous translation. Maybe you could just point us to what you thought those were and how those sort of maybe gave you some motivation to work on this. And then even just more generally, I mean, to shelve something and then to return to it after a couple of decades, maybe several decades, like what urged you to return to it? And yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
And the press, sorry, WB, can you remind us of the press that it's published through?
Yes, it's published by Anthem Publications. And
Thank you. Yeah.
I will give them thumbs up as being a fine commercial press, which is active in marketing, really doing the job on this that I've never seen any academic press I've worked with do. So I'm really happy to have them carry this book forward.
And it takes some courage to issue a sort of critical edition that has both languages. I mean, that's,
Yes.
as you mentioned, it increased the size. And Butterworth, whom we were talking before we started recording, was my professor and David's professor, has just finished an edition of Al-Farabi's commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, which is Arabic on one side and English on the other. I mean, they're such great tools, but I can understand why a publisher would be reluctant to double the length of a book.
Yes.
And it's got to be such a more difficult task. So I mean, I have so many questions, but one would be, how much manuscript work did you do? Like you had to choose, you didn't have to only choose a translation, you had to actually choose different French manuscripts, I assume. You had to go through and be like, no, I like this edition, not this edition. I don't like this emendation. I mean, you must, I mean,
Yeah.
did you have to spend any time in France? That must have been awful if you did. I mean,
Well,
just terrible.
I
know.
began this project in France in 1969-70 when I was a Fulbright scholar. And that's
Wow.
when I started working on the manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale. And so I worked thoroughly through the manuscripts at the very beginning before I put the project on the shelf for a while. I've worked through all the editions. I have used the Versini text for this because it's in the public domain and it simplifies my work. But I've used it by checking it against everything else. That's why it remains critical. So yes, I thoroughly worked through all of the various editions and the forms in which it has appeared, and of course the other two English translations. And only now am I working through a third translation, which we never knew existed until the last couple of years, and I didn't discover until my book was publishing. And that was by George III, late King of England.
How about that?
I'll come back to that later, but it's a hugely important factor, which we'll want to talk about. So yes, I have worked patiently through the Montesquieu. I spent time at Le Bret in the library there, as well as at the Bibliothèque Nationale. I've been associated with the Académie de Montesquieu. I published short pieces, essays on it. And of course, I published the small collection of 3 fables of Montesquieu. And that's called The Personal and the Political. And I mention that now because to get back to Greg's question about this book and what made it important for me to do, the single important reflection that I would share with you is that it genuinely is a magnum opus, The Spirit of the Laws. That is to say, in all of his other works, we find elements that are brought together in The Spirit of the Laws, beginning with the Persian letters, tracking through the history of the Romans. It's not an accident that almost as much is written about the Romans in The Spirit of the Laws as was written in the book on the decline and greatness of the Roman Empire. So that he has brought it all together in one place. And then finally, as I emphasized in my initial essay in the commentary, talking about what distinguishes this translation from the previous ones, I begin with the very first word, spirit. And I have a long discussion on Voltaire's understanding and misunderstanding of that, and also the tradition's misunderstanding. And then I show the various acceptations of the word in order to underscore that for Montesquieu, the primary acceptation is mind, because this is a work of philosophical inquiry. It is not to be confused with the more modernistic attempts to discover zeitgeist or anything of that character. So that its being philosophical inquiry is the entry point to understanding what the translation requires. I wouldn't change spirit only because of the weight of tradition. But I've made clear that people understand that we're talking about the mind behind the laws. And therefore, it's a philosophical inquiry, and that it covers every significant philosophical topic with respect to politics, at least, all the way up through and including religion itself. And in that sense, it's perfectly parallel to Plato's Laws and a number of other such canonical texts.
Yeah, you know, it is unfortunate. I have that sense about the title of the Republic, for example. It's
Yeah.
pretty misleading. To say nothing of books like, you know, The Gay Science or something like that. But Greg, I think you were going to jump in, or no, was it David?
No, I had a quick question. So would you say that the one can understand Montesquieu's thought reading this book in isolation, or is it necessary to cobble together the Persian letters, let's say, and his short book on Rome? And as a second question, is there anything left untranslated of
Montesquieu's,
importance? Yeah, of
uh,
importance.
not of great significance. Even of the minor works, there are translations here and there, not necessarily always very good ones, but they're out there, and one can assemble them. But it is to be observed in terms of your initial question that the works that I say are all captured somehow in the spirit of the laws are all framed in response to important questions. One of the questions, for example, that's central to the spirit of the laws and runs all the way from the Persian letters through all of his works is the whole question of the propagation of religion. Now, what is, of course, astounding to the modern era is to discover the way in which he presents that, including connecting it with the most modern of things, commerce, because he doesn't mean by commerce merely trade in commodities and services. He really means intercourse. And just as I can't turn spirit into mind, I can't turn commerce into intercourse because of the weight of the tradition. But that's what he's talking about. And it's the intercourse in mores, manners, and ideas, as well as intercourse in goods and services that constitute the burden of commerce in the modern world from Montesquieu's perspective. So his intention to respond to Herodotus is explicit, it's plain, and clearly underscored in the course of the work. And everything I've said so far is only describing what we might call the philosophical apparatus of the work, which is extremely important and which has been underrepresented in interpretations heretofore. For example, when he identifies Julian, the Emperor Julian, as characterizing Christ as an atheist, he's essentially presenting there what will later show up in Nietzsche as a thesis of the death of God. But that's something that has gone totally unremarked through all the centuries that we've been reading this work, or those of us who've read it. And so it has been a burden and important for me to bring out all of these essential elements of philosophical reflection as the core of the spirit of the laws in order to liberate it from the prison of a mere sociological or historical anthropological analysis.
Was this you said you've used this phrase "weight of the tradition" a few times. When the book first came to light, do you think it was more immediately understood, or was already the confusion amongst the public, or at least the public that could access the book?
Well, I think it was in part understood and in part not. For example, I give the example toward the end of the commentary of Daniel Fold in Massachusetts, who applied it in his defense of freedom of the press, clearly understanding Book 12, if nothing else, is Spirit of the Laws, and the thought that there could be no such thing as crimes of thought. So it was read, and that was read in the French by Paul at that time. Clearly, one can see from the translation that he provided. So clearly there was some understanding, and we know that what launched me in Montesquieu to begin with was a dispute between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists as to who interpreted him correctly. And so we know from that there was some sensitivity in analysis involved, so that when Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 9 translate the critical passage, an assembly of a society of societies, rather than as the anti-federalists preferred to translate it, he was actually channeling the French more accurately. So he could see producing one society out of many societies as the foundation for creating the extended republic, whereas the anti-federalists saw the opposite. So there were those differences in analysis throughout the 18th century. And of course, they were highlighted in the French Revolution because many of the French revolutionists actually rejected Montesquieu. That wasn't true of someone like Jacques Piaget, who understood him very well, and later Tocqueville. But there were others who at the time, including Destutt de Tracy and others, who didn't quite understand Montesquieu. So there were variable analyses and interpretations.
It's pretty remarkable. I mean, the book was published in 1748. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And has a, I mean, it must have had been immediately celebrated. What was the early sort of initial reception, and then how did it gain such currency so quickly that it's basically helping form? It's one of the most quoted, right, texts by the founders. It's already helping form a whole new frame of government. Obviously, there's all this other, philosophical background that Montesquieu is sort of riding, but that's pretty remarkable. That already across an ocean, they're sort of using it as a kind of textbook for a frame of government.
I think using it as a textbook is a wonderful expression to use, because I don't think it's so much that he caught the wave as that coming at the tail end of a previous wave, the Hobbes to Locke wave. He changed directions, and there was an eagerness to grab at that. That's why George III ended up studying it so closely. That's why the Duke of Richmond studied it so closely. That's why Berwick was attentive to it. So what was going on at this point in time, once the work appeared, was that everyone realized in it something powerful and unexampled. And when he tells us early on in Spirit of the Laws in Book 3 that the British Constitution is a republic disguised as a monarchy, he opened the world to a new line of thought that had not previously been considered. And the rest of the book develops that, such that eventually we reach the point where the whole movement, and let's forget about the American Revolution for the moment, the whole movement of modernity comes to be the movement to throw off the disguise.
Can we talk a little bit about his education and learning that he developed? Where is this in his life? What was his upbringing? How did he? I mean, the sheer volume of references, the depth of reading.
Oh, that's the first thing that hit me as a student.
Yeah, as well as the depth of insight as well, right? There's a lot of scholars can read a lot, and they get only so far, but he seems, able to synthesize all sorts of material. Can you talk a little bit about Montesquieu the man, how he got to be so wise?
Yeah, he read voraciously. If you were to visit this library of his at Le Bred, you would understand immediately. It is an absolutely extraordinary facility and absolutely beautiful. It would be hard not to read sitting in a space like that, with these high vaulted ceilings, with this very richly textured wood all around you, exuding warmth, packed from floor to ceiling with books of every stripe. And essentially, they were the fruits of his own collecting efforts. So he was a voracious reader. He was trained in the law initially. He, of course, spent time as a jurist there in the Bordeaux region, where he began his professional career, but not for very long, because he was still very young when he published the Persian Letters and went off to join l'Académie Française in Paris, and really never looked back after that. He became a man of letters by 1723. And that's what he remained for the next 30 years, a man of letters. And yes, he read not only all things ancient, but he read copiously of the modern literature, commentaries, journals, etc. So the breadth of exposure that he identifies in the course of his writings is perhaps the most distinctive feature of his entire background. He read, he took notes, and remember, for a substantial portion of his career, his sight was not very good, and he had to work with secretaries, and he would dictate to them, and they would write down his thoughts. So you just have to imagine this 18th century non-electric, non-computer-based society, reading as much as he read, composing as much as he composed, and having to use the conventions that were accessible to him. Clearly, he was completely committed to the life of the mind. That's
So-
the fundamental point you have to observe. Go right ahead, David.
Oh, so I had a quick question. Some philosophers, they they're not stuck in the same mode or mode of presentation, but many are. I'm curious if you've read any personal letters that explain the transition from the highly stylized and like almost like a fun whodunit of the Persian letters to this transition to deciding to write the spirit of the laws, because stylistically they're different. He has an incredible sense of humor. It reads like a detective novel, obviously, and Stuart Warner brings this out. But anybody that kind of decides to do the math on the dating of the letters, and some don't have dates, understand that there's something peculiar at play. And of course, he begins the spirit of the laws with this idea of a thread that you have to unravel oneself. But
Yes.
do you know anything about the transition between works in mode of presentation and why?
Well, I fundamentally maintain that there's not really a transition. He says at the end of his preface, The Spirit of the Laws, et moi aussi je suis peintre. I too, with Correggio, am an artist. Now, we all know he never painted anything. And therefore, we have to try to penetrate what he means by calling himself an artist. And I think that has to do with the mode of presentation that you're now describing. That is to say, he addresses certain topics prosaically, but with structure, with form, with purpose, so that he's a Correggio only in the sense that Correggio is more or less like the poet Marat, who has explicit poems on this theme, and which seem to describe the work that Montesquieu is about. And then finally, the one thing that really snared me with The Spirit of the Laws, which is my first Montesquieu, remember, not any of the other works, was to discover just how poetic it is. It is an extraordinarily beautiful book in terms of his prose style. And yes, his joking, the wonderful turns of phrase, the use of the vernacular where appropriate. And of course, when he says, my aim at the end of book 11 is not to make you read, but to make you think, he's underscoring what the design of all that stylism is about. So that you have a man there who doesn't hesitate to speak in terms of, how shall we say this, of paradoxes. So take the most evident paradox, all virtue has need of limits. Can you really have too much virtue? Well, in a certain context, yes, if what you're paying attention to is what virtue requires. That is to say, you can be more exigent than these contingencies permit. And that's what he's talking about when he says all virtue has need of limits. But he doesn't deny virtue. So you have an application of Aristotle that is not merely Aristotelian. And when he says that the self-governing soul, the self-governing human being is the free soul, that embraces, from his perspective, the whole of Aristotle. And when he says, if you want to understand me, you have to compare me to Plato and Aristotle, he really means it. He really means exactly that. So what we have to just do is to see that what we're dealing with Montesquieu, unlike, say, I will say Fontaine, to take just another example, highly stylized, very poetic, who says, among other things, that the purpose of his poetry is to make men good. So he makes what sounds like an almost Platonic claim, though he's not nowhere near a Platonist. And Montesquieu is almost the opposite of that. He doesn't make Platonic claims. He doesn't even make Aristotelian claims, but he claims to answer Platonic Aristotelian questions.
Did you say something more about that? Let's just push forward, full steam ahead. How is he asking this question without being clear about this aim, or how is this somehow the subdued theme of his work?
Well, to get to the answer to that, you have to go to the beginning of the book and understand why he dismisses Hobbes and why he's silent about Locke. And both of those things are very important. He dismisses Hobbes and he takes it for granted, almost as if he were anticipating Leo Strauss, that when you've dismissed Hobbes, you've dismissed Locke. And then what he needs to say by that is this. What he says of Hobbes is he treats human beings in nature as if they were in society. People only need to lock their doors once they have societies, not before. And so he's going to make an argument for natural society, which means he's returned to Aristotelian anthropology. So the foundation of his entire edifice is an Aristotelian anthropology, but it's not freighted with an argument for a telos. It's freighted with an argument for the necessary response to contingencies governed by laws of nature. Now, whether that's a modern or an ancient concept, one has to struggle through, and that's where the philosophy enters into his reasoning. Go right ahead, Greg. Interrupt me at any time.
Well, I just had a question. I see the Aristotle bit. I was wanting to float a harebrained idea past you. This mention of poetry. I mean, he's got this invocation of the muses later on. There's this Erechtheus right at the beginning. I'm wondering if there isn't some Lucretius in the background as well with the anthropology, but also like the way that, I mean, this is going to sound really harebrained, but the way he repeats the phrase, the nature of things at the beginning several times.
Yes.
Wasn't this around the time that sort of Lucretius was being rediscovered, it seems, or maybe actually a little later, but
yeah, it's a little later than the humanist era, but
Yeah.
he's certainly very aware of Lucretius. He mentions Lucretius. I think what you can do is to look at that one expression he makes when he says it's 1,000 times easier to do good than to do well, in order to sum up what the entire enterprise is about. Why is he not a Platonist? It's hard to do well. It's hard to do well. Everybody can do some good, but it's hard to do well. And so you might call this a kind of philosophy of realism if you want to descend to that level of analysis. So it seems to me that in that sense, if you consider Lucretius a realist, well, that would be a Lucretian element in his thinking. And he certainly did pay a lot of attention to the Stoics.
okay. Thank you.
You know, one thing we neglected to do, maybe our producer Jake can splice this into the beginning or just leave it, is to describe the structure of the book, how it's broken down. I mean, there are parts to it, and then there are chapters. Some chapters say to be continued, which is strange because you can just combine chapters. So I was wondering if you could talk about the structure and then.
Oh, numbers time. I love it.
Well,
Keep
this
going,
is Greg's
David.
a big numerologist. He stared directly at the sun yesterday.
My eyes hurt.
He takes it very seriously. And then maybe later, or if it makes sense now, I would love some advice for our younger listeners on approaches to this book, especially to some of the games that he's up to.
Well,
but first, maybe the superstructure.
Yeah, let me put it this way. He never says to be continued. Rather, he says continuing the same.
Oh, that's right.
It's an important distinction. It's an important distinction.
No.
Come on, David. It's not Batman from the 1960s, for goodness sake.
Not one of his careful readings.
Yeah, David keeps waiting for the sequel. You know, Spirit of the Lost 2, Spirit Heart.
Yeah.
Spirit harder.
But so I'm not going to descend into numerology, but I will say this to you. It is clear there are 31 books. It is clear there's a central to the whole edifice, and that's books 15, 16, and 17. It's clear that the central books are a rejection of slavery in every form. And so one starts with that, asking, why is it so important to reject slavery? And I think if you then go back to the beginning of the book, carrying that question in mind, you begin to understand the distinction in the forms of law, the laws of nature, laws of God, laws of philosophy, laws of religion, political laws, each carefully parsed in that initial book of the Spirit of the Laws, because one needs that in order to lay the foundations for the emergence of a natural society, which is going to awaken in human beings those tendencies to seek power from the moment the advantages of collective agency become apparent. So you have the family, that's no big deal, it causes no great problems. But families grow, they become extended families, so they become communities. And then one discovers that a community has a collective agency that exceeds what any individual has. And whoever gets to command that collective agency can not only exercise great influence to his or her own advantage within the community, but more importantly, vis-a-vis external communities. And so then you have set in motion, quite by nature, not by design, a system or a process which has perverse consequences, which is the, in principle, unlimited growth of power, ultimately despotism. Against that background, politics emerges. So we have been under the impression, according to Montesquieu, that politics is somehow a natural human response to nature. Montesquieu's argument is no, politics is the response to the excesses of power. The whole purpose of politics is to limit power. And that's what therefore gives rise to deliberate constitutions. And hence the book moves immediately into discussion of constitutions. So for the first section of the book, the first 8 books are really all about those deliberate constitutions with a carrot around despotism, which is not properly a constitution, but the thing against which everything else is responding. And so he used that as a field clearing exercise. And when he completes the field clearing, then he can talk about the actual circumstances people now face in human society. And that leads him to the books dealing with offensive and defensive postures, perfectly consistent with the emergence of power in politics. Once that's done, everything else becomes a matter of constitutionalism. You have had deliberate constitutions based on simple principles of virtue, honor, and fear, which prove insufficient for differing reasons that are laid out. You need something more than that. And so now you need a deliberate constitutionalism that goes beyond the choice of principles and that focuses exclusively on what is required seriously to limit power. And so the modern constitution will be a power limiting framework. That's how it becomes detached from virtue and honor. So that's the outline of what you might call the political mission of the Spirit of the Laws is. But that mission cannot be satisfied unless you also respond to the fundamental questions underlying the human condition. So he starts over in book 14 with climate or material determinism. And from there through 18, he disposes of material determinism, i.e., it's real, it exists, it's a contingency people face, it's not determinative.
Because like
yes, go ahead.
The Dutch can conquer it, and the Japanese, and there are other examples of people who are able to overcome their
That
it's
was
not
a
all
stumbling-
sheep tongues.
No, that was a stumble. Remember, Greg, that was when we read it
Yeah,
with Butterworth. That was such a stumbling block for us in class. What the heck's going on with this climate?
Yeah.
I like the discussion of how the polygamy stuff was kind of fun, but
yeah, well, of course. I mean, in several directions, right, Alex?
like, wait, that's okay.
But then also like a good lawgiver will counteract the ill effects of climate, but a bad lawgiver will exacerbate the ill effects of climate,
Precisely.
Right.
So that shows the element of deliberateness that's involved, which means the element of mind, you see.
Right.
So it turns out to be a work of the mind that's critical. Yes, culture is important, climate's important, traditions, all these things are important, soil, terrain, mores, manners.
Religion.
Religion especially so. But
Right.
ultimately, it's the question of mind addressing all of these questions in a way that is able to construct what we would call the deliberate constitution in the true sense of the term.
I like the way you're focusing on spirit as mind instead of spirit, because I'd always sort of, because even he defines the spirit of the laws as sort of comprising all of these things, right?
Yes.
At one point, it's all that, but then your emphasis on mind says, no. The mind can comprise all these things, but then the mind, it sort of assigns a priority to mind
Yes.
Whereas if the spirit would sort of treat them as though they're all, it's just, that's all of them mixed together in a mash.
That's right. The word spirit treats it as if it's something that just springs forth from a
Right,
background.
right.
But no, he's talking about a creative force in that
Yeah,
sense.
that's very good.
But not merely positivist.
That's very
Yeah.
helpful.
You make this point in your commentary right up front that
Mhm.
the primary meaning of esprit in French is like way down the list in the OEG.
Yeah,
So
right.
like we're bound to misunderstand it, even though it's a cognate word, right?
Yes.
Spirit. We're bound to misunderstand it because it's a very remote and rarely used meaning of the word spirit. We usually think of, somebody with like, I don't know, like
Yeah, go ahead.
Paranormal.
What were you?
something coming,
paranormal.
ghosts,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
things like that.
But of course, that was Voltaire's mistake too. Not that he had the English problem, but because there are other meanings of esprit in French, and including wit. And so his jocularity about whether there was spirit or wit, mind or wit in the book was meant to be depreciating. But
But surely, but do you have any thoughts on why? So Montesquieu would have known surely that the word was equivocal.
Mhm.
Why not choose something that more unequivocally sort of points to mind?
It just doesn't sell, Greg. It doesn't sell.
Got it. Got it.
That's true.
Spirit sells.
But remember, esprit in French it's equivocal in terms of having many acceptations, but the primary acceptation really is
Okay.
mind.
Okay.
So,
All right. Fair enough.
So every literate Frenchman ought to recognize that.
Yeah.
But Mr. Nugent,
Take that, Voltaire.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's
So-
not get into the sins of Arouet. I mean, he's
Yeah.
got his
There you
problems.
are. There you are. So anyway, just to get back to the structure of the book for a moment. And so what I'm seeing is there's clearly an orderly progression through the book. And that becomes more complicated as you advance. And then you reach the final books. And this is the thing that I describe in my acknowledgments when I point out that what Leo Strauss led me to understand that I had not really seen through all my close study of the work. And like most people, I read it through and I landed on book 11, the separation of powers, checks and balances, independent judiciary, all those things that are so familiar to us. And those things that are familiar to us actually get in the way of understanding often because we glom onto what we know. And so when I returned from France after that first trip, spending a year working on this, and Leo Strauss was living in Annapolis, and I began working at the American University in Washington, D.C. One of my very first things was to hop in the car and go over and call on Leo Strauss just to give a report of what I'd been doing. And so I sat in his small cottage there in Annapolis, telling him about my adventures, teaching French students, studying Montesquieu. And he started talking. And he began talking about the spirit of the laws. And he began quoting. Yeah, we didn't have any text in front of us, just quoting from memory, from the final books of the spirit of the laws.
Huh.
It just blew me away. I mean, we all know what those last three books are like. And they're sort of French history of the most elementary.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
and most of us read it and we just skip right over that, pass by it, and don't pay it much attention. And I'm wondering, why is Leo Strauss quoting from memory from those books? And that more than anything else shaped my eventual study of the spirit of the laws and forced me to work my way through the whole thing and put it in perspective. So whether Strauss did that deliberately or just his habit, I cannot tell you. He didn't explain himself, but he certainly put me in a posture where I could not possibly fail to do anything other than wrestle with those chapters before I thought I had completed the spirit of the laws.
Wow. So two questions. One is, did you ever consider maybe he was just reading it that morning and it happened to be fresh on his mind?
Well, we were all familiar with that, but
but then the second question is, what did that? I mean, I'm joking, but what did that lead you to? Like, what was the significance of these apparently less significant chapters?
So it made me take seriously the historical dispute that Montesquieu carries on in the last three books with people like Dubois and others. Well, why is he digging so deeply into this? I mean, I could see up through book 28 when you're dealing with the questions about trial by combat and those kinds of things. That makes some sense. You're still talking mores and manners then, and you're talking about the discontinuity between what human reason calls for and what human practice provides. All of that fits in a broader philosophical conversation. And then you have the chapter on, or the book on founders, legislators, which seems to be terminating everything. And instead, he closes and he goes into this dense historical work. And so what it did was force me to pay attention to that dense historical work. And some things began to emerge. Among them was an appreciation for the first time of what the contingencies were that he was really concerned about, which were not the contingencies of climate or material contingencies, but they were the moral contingencies and the way in which people navigate them. And that history shows the potential for that navigation that can eventuate in opportunities to form a deliberate constitution. So that he was actually foreshadowing a French future in those final chapters, which he's not discussed throughout the book theretofore, remember. That's one of the most extraordinary things about the entire book. You might find a stray passage here or there that somebody interprets as referring obliquely to France. And certainly in book 18, when he's talking about the Salic laws, we get some notion of ancient France, as well as the broader region there. But it's not until those last three books that you actually see a focus on the emerging France and what a projected future might be. And that, so I had to stay with it long enough to appreciate that what he was doing there was projecting. This historical development was not explanation, it was projecting. And he gives this dramatic signature to it by closing the book with Italiam Italiam. I have found Rome.
Yeah, because otherwise your eyes would just gloss over with Charles the Bald.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's hard to keep all of that stuff in mind because, we read it in other contexts and we don't think, it's just hard to separate Pepin and Charlemagne and all the rest of them one from another at a certain point. But he had a purpose.
You had mentioned wanting to talk about slavery, and you'd sort of talked about that already a little bit as being central, literally central to the book and sort of informing what he's up to. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say. I've taught some of those books before, and I admit that I find them really fascinating, but like some of it, like students these days can not realize some of the sarcasm that's going on. I mean, most famously in the account of Black slavery and stuff like this, and sort of miss how he's sort of really taking people to task for this. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say, or those chapters or books in particular, but
I think that's really the great observation, and that's where, going back to his style, see the poetry of it all. That book 15 is incredible that way.
It's so funny.
It's so very funny, and to be the first secular attack on race-based slavery. I mean, that's dramatic. That has shaped the world in ways that people aren't even appreciative of. But then that he carries it through with women and with social distinctions means that there's a broader base. He's not concerned with race as the fundament. That's just one thing that has to be knocked down because it's a recently emerged perversion. But he's actually going back to the end of book 5, when you remember he has a chapter called On the Administration of Women. Now, that's another one of those translation problems that I have pointed out. I don't translate it the administration of women. I translate it the management of women, because we can get the subtleties involved in what he's saying if we use management in English. And that will be conveyed in French by administration, but not when you transliterate administration into administration. So when he makes the observation, yes, of course, women can rule the state, but they must not rule the household. Well, that sounds like a paradox to us, but it's not a paradox. It's perfectly consistent with the broader argument that he's making. And that is the theme that's carrying through those chapters on slavery, i.e., the distinctions must be made in terms of human capacity and not in terms of conventions. It's no different than Aristotle's attack on conventional slavery.
Yeah, that's right. Very good. I mean, I'm even reminded of like when I teach his students, I try to draw out. I mean, the way that he sort of attacks punishing witches, even
Yes.
And sort of, he's like, look, what are you guys doing? Who cares? Like, you get, they don't, they're either really witches, in which case you can't do anything, or they are, and they aren't, which is probably more likely, in which case there's no point. Like, just leave them, let these crazy old ladies be.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's similar in matters of sort of religious things. It's an amazing sort of, liberalism, really. It's sort of just like, there's no reason for the state to be involved in this, in such things.
And moreover, the state can't do anything useful in relationship to them.
Exactly right.
The idea that Julian failed to stop the spread of Christianity in Rome is hugely important, because Julian was trying to save the empire, and of course he lost the empire. But when he lost the empire, Christianity did not fall. That's something that people often overlook to remark. Not only did it not fall, but the conquering barbarians became Christians. So it triumphed in the midst of the fall of Rome. Montesquieu is deeply impressed by that, much more impressed than Machiavelli was. And that may have a lot to do with what he means when he says we are curing ourselves of Machiavellianism every day.
I hadn't considered that. That's really interesting. I mean, his account of the emergence of monotheism in general is also very impressive. Just thinking through of how these things emerge in sort of response to sort of Newtonian physics offsetting the powers of the government or the state or something like this. Really, really neat stuff.
No, that's actually well observed on your part. It's not present in the spirit of the laws per se, but I have an essay on as you know, in the commentary on the natural laws. And they're derived almost exclusively from his understanding of Newtonian mechanics and the sense in which Newton, as in his De Gravitatione, sees that one has to contemplate God in relationship to the material as that which is capable of creating the effect of the material without being material, which is a very interesting way of phrasing the notion of God, and which Montesquieu appreciated in his reading of Newton. So all of his technical experiments, his freezing of lambs' tongues and one thing or the other, these all fall within those broad parameters that somehow at the end of thinking, and I'm going to emphasize the end of thinking, not the end of the day, not the end of the universe, but at the end of thinking, and this is where Montesquieu stands. These things all must be seen in that light in which one can understand them as belonging together, even if one can't adequately comprehend or express them. That's Montesquieu's perspective.
I just one last question about
first. Montesquieu, tough on slavery, soft on witches.
Soft on witches. That's right. That's right.
I don't know, any parting thoughts before we move?
I had one final question actually.
Campaign against Montesquieu. He's soft on witches.
I just had one final question, WB. And it's spending this much time with the thinker in a work of this magnitude and depth. Did you start to begin to think of Montesquieu as someone whose mind you began to inhabit, like he became a friend, and you began to think like him, or began to think, well, this isn't what old Baron D would think about X, Y, or Z, I've not spent nearly as much time, and it's a much shorter work, but I've done a little translating of Xenophon and Plato, and I feel like when you're spending that much time in the original language, you just begin to think that you're talking to the person. I mean, maybe that's a weird way of putting it, but. Or what were you saying here? What were you saying here, Montesquieu? What's the best way for me to translate that into English? Or how should I do this? Or spirit's not going to work.
Yeah, you just talk to him when nobody's around. But to piggyback on that, when you hang out with the living Montesquieus in France, do you ever set them aside and say, look, let me tell you something about your ancestor that you may not appreciate?
This is all very interesting that you would make these comments. And I always have that feeling, when I translated Xenophon's Agesilaus, I felt like Xenophon. I really did. I think that's a powerful little dialogue.
I didn't know you did that.
Deeply into it. I didn't publish it, but
That's
I translated it. But when I did all the work on George Washington, which meant reading all the manuscripts I could possibly lay my hands on, I became George Washington, frankly. It's unavoidable.
Yeah.
And certainly.
I have a small point on that real quick, by the way.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend of mine today, and he described you as George Washington. He said he has this, I'm not joking, that Jeff Siginga said he has a very statesman-like way about him. He reminds me of George Washington.
Does
So
that
maybe
mean that
maybe he
Bill,
met you when you were writing that book.
does that mean
Yeah.
that like when Bill gets angry, he has like furious, uncontrollable rage?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but anyway, it's true. But you see, I do have a friend who is seventh generation grandson of Montesquieu, who is Charles Montesquieu, Charles II, who lives in Versailles. And when the book was published, I immediately, well, not immediately, but on a fitting moment, I brought up, because he had a winery himself called Chateau Raymond there in Bordeaux, from which I have had several volumes for decades. And I had a few left. And I pulled up a 1983 uh, Chateau de Montesquieu, Baron de Montesquieu, from the Chateau Raymond, and opened it as we opened the book and toasted.
wow.
I couldn't toast Charles because he wasn't here. He's over there, but he and I were exchanging notes, and I toasted him. So yes, I mean, he's part of the family. I felt like part of the family. So much
That's
part of the
beautiful.
family that when my son was 14 years old, I was able to send him over to France to spend a couple of weeks with Charles's son Cyril on a Boy
Wow.
Scout expedition in the French countryside. So yes, these things have a way of taking over your life. If you, I
That's
don't know any
amazing.
other way to put it.
Yeah.
So
No, that's really
I was just
nice.
gonna say we're gonna transition at this point, but when we get off, when we finish recording, you're gonna have to send me your translation of Xenophon. That just has to happen if you've got it lying around. But
Yeah,
at this point,
do
maybe
you have time for some biographical questions? Or do you
yeah.
have
Sure,
cherry tree to chop
absolutely,
down?
absolutely.
Yeah, so this will be this part, and then Greg finishes with lightning round questions, which is exactly what it sounds like.
Okay.
So Bill, go as long or short as you wish. Your path approaching the philosophic life, was there a turning point, or as a young man, were you predisposed towards these type of books, or was there an event or a teacher that turned you? And then as you got on with your studies, if there are any mentors or fellow students that you just wish to remember, we really like hearing those stories.
Well, you asked that question at a propitious moment because a couple of things are happening. One, I was just reading my senior memories book from my graduation from high school. I still have it. And it closes with my stating what my future was going to be. And I was going to go to college, graduate, get a job, save money, and go to medical school. And that was where I was headed. Well, I did graduate and I did go to college, and I was a pre-med student for 3 years. But several things happened along the way. Jerry Purnell was one of them. Jerry was my political science professor at Pepperdine, who was a wonderful mentor in political theory, who was a science fiction writer and ultimately left the academy to write, especially with Niven, his partner Niven, several important science fiction books. But nevertheless, began that process of my thinking through political science or political theory, not political science so much, as something I wanted to explore further. But it happened that he did that at a time when I was also a political activist. And that meant I had become relatively prominent in California politics, both as active in the Reagan campaign and prior to that, slightly so in the Goldwater campaign. And I had also been, therefore, on the speaker circuit and such things. And I was invited to give a talk on the New Left at the initial meeting of the Philadelphia Society in San Francisco. And that must have been in 1966. And so I appeared there and gave my talk and sat down. It turns out that Harry Jaffa was also one of the panelists in that program. And Harry Jaffa got up and gave his talk. And I relate this in my essay on what Harry Jaffa taught. But he got up and gave his talk, and when he was finished, my mouth hung open. And I said to myself, I have no purpose being here. I shouldn't be on the same platform. I don't know anything. And the only thing I can do is go wherever he is and learn something. And from that moment, I was headed to graduate school. And finished, applied, and got in where he was teaching graduate school, and had the good fortune to begin with the summer before graduate school started with a seminar with a few other brave souls with Leo Strauss, who was just then relocating to Claremont. And so I became the student of Strauss, Jaffa, and Martin Diamond in those critical years, every single one of whom played a very important role in my development. Go right ahead, Alex.
You share a couple of anecdotes. There's got to be a funny story there, I don't mean like Strauss slipped on a banana peel or something, but
No.
any particularly interesting, funny moments or
There are many learning
interest?
moments. My first paper for Harry Jaffa was learning how to die, which seems perhaps somewhat
Is that because of his
exceptional.
remarks on the paper?
No, that was the title of my paper. I mean, so here's
Oh, okay.
this fresh young graduate student pondering death. What's wrong? Something's wrong in this picture. And then in my first class with Mr. Strauss on the ethics, I was wrapped up writing on book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and at some point made some statement, which I can't even remember the substance of at this point, that led him into one of his classic moments in which he lifted his eyebrow, looked up at me, and he said, "An extreme of the me?" Sounded like a good idea at the time. So things like that, of course, happened, but the most profound thing, I think, were just the classes themselves, and certainly Martin Diamond, who was the most compelling classroom performer I have ever seen in my entire life. He was a simply extraordinary craftsman in the classroom. Made all the difference.
We don't talk about him enough on this podcast. Share some more about that. What he was like as a teacher and mentor.
Well, he was avuncular, for one thing. In some ways, if an old Trotskyite can be avuncular, and he was certainly highly what's the word to use? He spoke with a great facility of language, so very colorful. And the language was at the same time elevated. And there was nothing banal about it, and he was able to address the fundamental questions in ways that gave them a liveliness. So you're talking about the Federalist Papers, for heaven's sakes. I mean, he made them sound like the greatest drama that was ever written. It is really rather remarkable to sit before him and listen to this. And so, and of course, we all had conversations and had wonderful times together. So things like that were fairly much the substance of my graduate education and made all the difference. It was interrupted by my being drafted and sent off to the military, which left me in a position of not knowing how to get back because I lost fellowship and everything, and I had to go and sign up for the Army. And so I was out for half a year in the wilderness, so to speak. And then out of nowhere, Marty called me up and said, "I got a fellowship for you. Come back to school." So he was my angel at that moment, and he restored what I thought I had lost. So there are a number of things like that over the years that were just quite compelling for me and made the difference. So I was able to move on and finish my work, go to France, and everything else has been history since.
That's great. That's great. Thank you.
Well, WB, if you'll excuse the indignity of asking someone with the stature of George Washington, we have some silly questions we like to ask folks, so that folks can get to know you and see what kind of personality you have. It's been a delight speaking with you so far.
It's been a real honor. Thank you.
Yeah, it has been an honor.
Thank
So
you.
I've just got some random questions, and you should feel free to answer them as quickly as you like, or say not answering, move, pass, whatever. But we'll start easy. Who's your favorite philosopher?
My favorite philosopher, I cannot escape the Platonic heritage.
Very good. Do you have a favorite work of philosophy?
Well, I have devoted a fair amount of time to Plato's Laws. There are others, the Phaedrus, the Crito, the Gorgias, the Meno, and many of them, including the Republic, that I pay close attention to. but I have never been able to escape the laws.
Laws. We'll have to have you
There-
back to talk about the laws
there's
sometime.
theme here.
Yeah. Spirit of laws, the laws. Yeah, very
Yes,
good.
there's
Very
a
good.
connection there.
I'm thinking so. What about a favorite work of literature?
Is laws the connection?
Yeah, a favorite work of literature. That's a little harder.
How about a
to
favorite work of
parse.
literature, Bill?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm going to say that's a little harder to parse. As you know, I've
Sorry,
written on
sorry.
Harriet.
That all just broke up. That
Oh,
just
I'm sorry about that. Let me get
sorry,
my.
that just broke up.
Yes.
Greg, can you repose? That's okay.
No, it was my fault.
Greg,
It was my
can you
fault.
repose the question so that Jake can edit out the chaos?
Yeah, sure. How about a favorite work of literature, WB?
Yeah, that's harder to parse because, as you know, I've written a book on Harriet Beecher Stowe, which I
Mhm.
found her to be a very compelling intelligence. But I also like Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time, which I think
Oh, I
is a
love that book.
wonderful, wonderful book.
It
Uh,
is.
and there are so many other things that I thoroughly enjoy, but those two
I
really
haven't
stand
yeah.
out for me.
I haven't reread that since I was a child. I should get back to that. It was such a delightful book. So
I
imaginative.
read it to my children, and I go back to it and I read it again and again.
That's very nice. What was your first job?
My first job was mowing lawns when I was 12 years old.
Very good. What was your first car?
I wish I could remember. I think it was a Pontiac Tempest, but I'm not sure. It was a used
very
car.
nice. Very nice. Okay. Yeah, my first car was a used car. Favorite place you've ever visited?
Oh, that's so much harder. I've been so many places. Favorite place I've ever visited. I don't know that I can answer that question with any precision. I have
Okay.
found it just so many places. When I love watching the whales sitting on a patio at Cape Town, I'll put it that way.
That sounds quite lovely. Who is the best U.S. politician in your lifetime?
Ronald Reagan.
Very good. Seems found. Do you have any pets?
I am not a pet person. I
Fair
don't
enough,
have
fair enough.
pets. I had to suffer my children having pets and going off to college and sticking me with the pet. And I had to be the one
Yeah.
to bury it. And I've never forgiven them.
Oh, that sounds awful. That's not very nice.
Well, they go off to college. You say it's the darndest thing.
Yeah.
A couple hours after you left, something happened, just croaked.
Yeah.
A couple hours.
Well,
Oh man,
basically.
Penelope, watch out for your dad. All right, last question. If you hadn't become a professor, what do you think you would have become?
Dead.
That first graduate research paper was really, this is learning how to die.
I thought that
That's
was
fun.
referencing
Japa said you've come to the right place, Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Let's make sure the folks at home get this one more time, just so we know. This is
Yes.
your new edition, a critical edition. Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, which includes a translation, a critical edition. It's got interesting, excellent notes. It also has a very long commentary, which is really sort of laying out the argument of the entire work. This is with Anthem Press. Much kudos to Anthem Press for the courage to put out such an impressive tome. It was a delight having you on. I do hope you come back. Thanks for everything. David, Alex, any final words? Alex, you look sunburned. Were you out just stargazing yesterday?
No, I've just been reading in the sun. What does he call it? No, I'm thinking of I was reading Frankenstein. It talks about the land of eternal light.
That one, yes.
Trying to enjoy the eternal light, bask in the sun, the forms, all that.
Well, I want to thank you all for this conversation. It's been wonderful. Encourage everyone to make sure their libraries get a copy.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We will. And we'll plug it on the show and on Twitter and all that stuff too. So don't you
Okay.
worry.
Great.
It's been real
All
fun.
right.
We'll see you guys next week on the new Thinkery. Doodle 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 doo.
Okay.
All right. Thank you,
Good night to
WB.
you.
Okay.
That was
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you all
Thank you
so
very much.
much. Appreciate it.
All right. All righty. Take care, WB.